Hello and welcome to Frankfurt, out in Germany. Absolutely beautiful day here. Sun is shining, and what a lovely little spot to sit in the peace and quiet and catch up with the new read of Mosquito by Rowland White. Um, we recently read chapters 1 and 2 from part 1 of the book, which gave us a bit of a background really to the history of the de Havilland Mosquito aircraft and some of the people who flew it. And we're now moving on to chapter 3 of part 1. No longer welcome in Italy, now that Mussolini had thrown in his lot with Hitler, Monica and her family were forced to leave. After securing exit permits in Rome, they travelled north by train through Germany toward Denmark, while her husband, Jürgen, dealt with submachine gun carrying uniformed customs officials. Monica's head remained buried in a red dust jacketed copy of Into Battle, a collection of Winston Churchill's wartime speeches published earlier in the year. It was as close as she could bring herself to keeping her promise to Jürgen not to be unnecessarily provocative. The book's title neatly summed up her mood, though, and after travelling through Berlin, where Monica made notes she thought might be helpful to the British, the family spent the night in Warnemünde, the northern port where they'd catch the ferry back to Denmark. Despite nearly being killed when their accommodation was hit by an RAF bomb that failed to explode, both Monica and her 20-year-old daughter Varinka, Inki to her family, were pleased to note that British bombers were already hitting the German mainland. It was, thought Inki, quite an experience. Mother and daughter were cut from the same cloth. After a peripatetic upper-class childhood that had left her never really feeling Danish, Inki had wept with rage on hearing news that Germany had stolen her country. And after moving back to the Engestofte, both women were appalled by the well-fed smugness of many of their fellow landowners in Lolland. There was money to be made from selling meat and dairy produce to the occupiers, not least the fat pigs bred specially to cater to German appetites and to which premium was paid. But to Monica and her daughter, this felt like collaboration. You will discover patriotism only when your stomach suddenly feels empty, she told one of them. Monica and Inky were agreed. We must do something to fight the Germans. A shared love of Proust convinced a communist writer renting accommodation on the Engestofte estate that the aristocratic Monica couldn't be all bad. Reassured, the tenant provided his landlady with an introduction to the nascent local resistance movement. At first, Monica and Inky's contribution was limited to distributing copies of Frit Danmark and raising money from wealthy friends to support families struggling after losing a breadwinner to arrest or escape because of the resistance. Both were hungry to do more. In the new year, her efforts would eventually lead her and her daughter to an organisation that, if its letterhead was to be believed, was called the Inter-Services Research Bureau. To those with sufficient levels of security clearance, it was a special operations executive. To its recruits, it was often known simply as the Racket, and humiliation in Sweden, a country that at its closest point was separated from Denmark by just 2.5 miles of water, had played a part in its inception. Fond of dark glasses, a Homburg hat, cigarette holder, and an ever-present red carnation in his buttonhole, Major Lawrence Grand was reckoned to be at best eccentric and possibly mad. He was also responsible for the Secret Intelligence Service's D section, D for destruction, he would explain. His department, although small, had people spread throughout Europe and as far afield as Baghdad, Cairo, and Constantinople. Grand's remit was direct action, rather than the gathering of intelligence, to plan, prepare, and when necessary carry out sabotage and other clandestine operations. The trouble was, as one senior Foreign Office official put it, Grand was almost always wrong, concluding that to pit such a man against the German General Staff and the German Military Intelligence Service is like arranging an attack on a Panzer Division by an actor mounted on a donkey. When, in April 1940, Grand's man in Stockholm was caught with a 53 kilogram of gelignite in his flat intending to disrupt German efforts to acquire Swedish iron ore, it only seemed to confirm it. D-Section's would-be saboteur was sentenced to 8 years hard labour, and Britain's embarrassed envoy to Sweden, Sir Victor Mallet, complained to London that our sleuths seemed to be thoroughly bad at their job. Ground was clearly not the man for the job, but the debacle in Sweden highlighted a more fundamental problem. Sabotage and destruction were simply at odds with the inconspicuous, often slow accretion of intelligence. What was needed, argued Hugh Dalton, Churchill's Minister for Economic Warfare, was a new secret agency independent of both the War Office and SIS, which fell under Foreign Office control, to coordinate, inspire, control, and assist nationals of the oppressed countries who must themselves be the direct participants. Pointing to the IRA, Chinese resistance to Japanese occupation, and even Spanish irregulars who, with Wellington's support, ejected Napoleon from Spain, as examples, Dalton outlined some of the methods they might employ, including industrial and military sabotage, labour, agitation and strikes, continuous propaganda, terrorist acts against traitors and German leaders, boycotts and riots. 2 weeks later, on 19th of April 1940, Dalton got what he wanted when, in perhaps his last significant political act before illness forced his retirement from the War Cabinet, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed the charter that ushered the Special Operations Executive into existence, an amalgamation of SIS's beleaguered D section, MIR, a branch of the intelligence dedicated to research that served a similar function to Q's department of James Bond legend, and a shadowy propaganda unit run jointly by the Foreign Office and Ministry of Information known only as the Department in Electra House. Dalton himself was given control of the new organisation. According to its charter, it was to coordinate all action by way of subversion and sabotage against the enemy overseas. Churchill put it more succinctly when, as his Minister for Economic Warfare made to leave the room, the PM simply urged him to set Europe ablaze. In Denmark, the job of making that happen was given to a mild-mannered 28-year-old part-time naval officer. On 7th of April 1940, Lieutenant Commander Rolf Hollingworth, RNVR, travelled to Funen, Denmark's third largest island, to check on minesweeping operations. Events then unfolded quickly. First, it was the presence of the Luftwaffe circling overhead in violation of Denmark's neutrality. Then Hollingworth was told of reports of considerable activity in the belts, the channels of water that separated Denmark's Jutland Peninsula from the archipelago that made up the rest of the country. Travelling east to investigate, he recorded the passage of 60 German ships through the Great Belt, the Storbelt in Danish, on 8th of April, and sent a coded message to the consulate in Copenhagen, warning that an invasion of Denmark by Germany appeared to be imminent. At 04:15 hours the following morning, the launch of Operation Weserübung Süd saw the Wehrmacht's 11th Motorized Rifle Brigade and 170th Infantry cross the border into their northern neighbour. From the outset, it was clear that the small Danish army of just 15,000, largely untrained recruits, was no match for the might of the German army. While in his teens, Rolf Hollingworth had jumped on a ferry to the continent as soon as he'd left school in Leicester in 1928, and had spent the next 3 years living in France and Germany before settling in Denmark. After 9 years in Copenhagen, he was supplementing the money he earned from working in a bicycle shop by teaching English in the evenings. But as a member of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, he was drafted into the British legation when war was declared to serve as a consular shipping advisor before joining naval intelligence to report on German naval movements. Now, with the German invasion in full flow, Hollingworth helped staff at the Vice Consulate on Funen burn all the classified material before phoning his friend, the city's Assistant Chief of Police, to check on the progress of the German assault on Odense. "Well, they are in the next room," the policeman told him, but I won't tell them you're here. After German troops were put ashore unopposed on both the east and west coast of Funen by the Kriegsmarine, it had required no more than a solitary motorcycle patrol to bring the island under complete German control. By the time Hollingworth took his seat on the 11:35 train out of Odense to return to the capital, Denmark's defeat was total. The irony was that Hitler never really wanted to invade and occupy Denmark at all. His northern neighbour was nothing more than a necessary stepping stone from which he could launch a Weserübung Nord, the invasion of Norway, that would provide access to Atlantic ports and year-round access to Swedish iron ore via the ice-free Norwegian port of Narvik. Now, under German protection, the country's neutrality would continue, as would the government's responsibility for internal affairs. In a somewhat surprising move, the army and navy were allowed to remain in business while handing over whatever material and real estate the Germans demanded, and the king and the cabinet were forced to submit to German censorship of newspapers and radio and oversight for the country's diplomatic affairs, the latter requiring the Danish to sever all relations with the Allies. For all the talk of neutrality, Denmark had effectively been subsumed into the Axis. With her host country's submission, Hollingworth and the rest of the staff of the British legation in Copenhagen were no longer welcome. Still basking in the success of their swift and largely bloodless invasion, and eager to flaunt their civility and magnanimity, the Germans agreed to lay on a special sealed train to carry the British diplomats safe and unmolested through Denmark, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands to Calais, then for passage home. As the train slowed to travel through the town of Fredericia on the east coast of Jutland, a waiting Danish army intelligence officer threw a rolled-up newspaper in through an open window. Inside it were documents giving details of German troop dispositions throughout Denmark. It was the first indication that the invaders' decision to allow the Danish military to remain on active duty might prove costly. By the beginning of November 1940, the young naval officer had been recalled from a posting to Iceland to set up the Danish section of the embryonic Special Operations Executive. The questionnaire he was required to complete on his recruitment provided an indication of the skill set that might be of value to his new employer. Could he, it asked, ride a horse, sail a boat, mountaineer, ski, shoot, fly an aeroplane, box or read and transmit Morse, drive, swim, run, bicycle or sketch? At just 5'6" tall and slightly built, the budding young spymaster could only answer yes to the last four. But he was personable, subtle in his dealings with others, and could offer a good line in dirty jokes. More importantly, he was completely fluent in Danish, spoke French and German too, and recorded his political views to be any policy directed towards furthering the war effort. With respect to the latter, he would have had his work cut out. When he arrived at SOE's Baker Street headquarters for the first time, he was shown to an office with a desk, a chair, and an empty in-tray and out-tray. He added an ashtray and lit a Player's Navy Cut cigarette. There would be many, many more of those. To his friends and colleagues he was known as Holly. For official work he adopted the cryptonym Chicory. Either way, it was clear that he was making something of a standing start. Britain's ability to hit back in the early years of the war was severely limited. Expelled from the continent after the evacuation from Dunkirk, only bomber command, commando raids, and fomenting resistance from inside Germany's mainland empire offered realistic options. While the RAF waited for a new generation of heavy bombers, SOE realised it would need to recruit British-trained agents who could move unnoticed in the countries in which they were sent to operate. The most obvious candidates were exiled citizens of those countries. But by comparison to his colleagues in SOE's other country sections, Holly faced a unique challenge. Unlike every other European country conquered and occupied by the Third Reich, Danish personnel were off limits. While the country might have been bullied into accepting Germany's interference under international law, she remained a neutral state whose king and democratically elected ministers remained in power and in situ. Unlike France, Belgium, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Norway, and the Netherlands, there was no government in exile to join the Allied cause and fight to throw the Nazis out of their homeland. Nor was there a cadre of exiled soldiers, sailors, and airmen to draw on. As an institution, Denmark's military had little choice but to remain loyal to their king, but he was king of Germany's model protectorate. Instead, the Danish talent available to Ralph Hollingworth drew on a pool of civilian volunteers who happened to be overseas at the time of the German invasion. In reality, that meant Danish expats so outraged by the news of their country's humiliation that they tried to join the British military or the large fleet of Danish fishermen and merchant seamen who, at sea on the morning of the invasion, accepted an invitation to turn west and head for British ports. A handful also managed to escape occupied Denmark. Monica Wichfeld's youngest son, 18-year-old Viggo, was one who tried, but after getting a job as a deckhand and jumping ship in Sweden, he was quickly picked up by Swedish police, returned to his ship and to Copenhagen, where he was met by his mother. While in the capital, Monica tried to see her friend Suzanne Lassen, a children's book illustrator whose most successful creation, Naughty Caroline, about a spirited, independent and willful little girl, was inspired by Monica's daughter Inky. Suzanne's own boys were no less front-footed in their approach to life. Indeed, over the next 5 bloody years, the Lassens and the Whitfelds would go to any lengths to bring about Germany's defeat, and that meant that they were of great interest to Ralph Hollingworth. Well, it's getting interesting. Chapter 4 is next. I hope you can join me back for that, coming soon.